Mr. Harris was recently named as one of America's top 100 trial lawyers. He's been practicing at Gallegos & Gallegos in LA for 16 years and is a actual living, breathing trial attorney. He spends most of his time in courtrooms. Somewhat uniquely from a Canadian perspective, he also tries both felony criminal trials and major civil litigation, including human civil rights violations, wrongful death actions, malicious prosecution cases, and class actions. This is actually his second book. Working on the Susan McDougal case led Mr. Harris to write a book entitled Susan McDougal, the Woman Who Wouldn't Talk. Susan McDougal, you'll recall, was the woman who was involved in the Whitewater affair during the Clinton years. That book spent 4 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Mr. Harris was born in Arkansas. Before attending law school, he served as a legislative assistant in Washington, D.C., and actually began his legal career in the Public Defender's Office in Nashville, Tennessee.
Being in Los Angeles, I was approached to be a legal consultant for a TV show. And the name of the TV show, which actually was on the air for a few years, was called Shark. I don't know if any of you remember that show. But I was the legal consultant for it. And when they first came to me, they said, the idea of the show is there's this really sleazy defense attorney, and one of his clients murders somebody, so he changes to the good guys and becomes a prosecutor. And he uses all those sleazy defense tactics to get as a prosecutor now on the other side. And we just want you to work on that. And I'm like, what sleazy defense tactics? I don't know. I can't help you with that.
We'll wrap up on a lighter note, and so I'm going to ask you to tell us that the best war story that didn't make it into the book.
Okay. Well, I could tell you, I'll tell you two, but I'll tell you one very shortly that isn't in the book. We talk about briefly a guy in the book named Sarkis Sogamalian. Sarkis was when I met him, he was about 70 years old, and came into the office one day, and he was sitting in a chair and he was asleep. And I walked into Mark's office and I said, "Who is the guy that's asleep outside your door here?" He says, "Oh, you mean the Merchant of Death?" I said, "What?" He says, Sarkis is the most famous arms dealer in the world. He had pretty much any war you can imagine, he had been selling arms to both sides. Iran, Iraq, that war he was selling both sides, the English and Argentina, the Falklands War. I mean, you name it, any war that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And 60 Minutes did a very large feature on him, and that's where he got the title, The Merchant of Death, because that's what they called the piece that they ran. So Sarkis was in our office because he had sort of some troubles with the U.S. government, and he would come pretty much every day. He'd sit in a chair, he'd fall asleep, and then he'd come in my office or Mark's office, and he'd sit down for about 30 or 45 minutes, and he would tell these incredible stories. Okay, I mean stories you just wouldn't believe. And then he'd go back to his chair and he'd fall asleep. And he would tell stories because he knew everybody. And this is a guy who could get, you name any world leader there was, he could get him on the phone. And he would tell these stories about, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, but his favorite stories were about George W. Bush. And he had the second one, the W, yes, thank you. He was around W in his earlier party days, and he would tell stories about W, and his favorite was a story about he and W in a bar in Cancun with George W. Snorting cocaine off some stripper's chest. He would tell these stories, and you would sort of think, how much of this is he making up? How much is he exaggerating? How much is this true? And so after we represented him, we ended up talking to the producer at 60 Minutes. And he started saying, he said, I checked into it, and I would talk to these people at the CIA and the National Security Agency, and he was working with them. He said, these stories would all check out. And he said it was just amazing how reliable this guy was, and we thought he was just some, kind of big blowhard or whatever. But he told us a story about, this is the one I love, the one I'll tell you here. He tells a story about the U.S. comes in under the first George Bush and puts him in prison. Charged him with some arms dealing problem or some issue. And Sarkis was furious because he had been very good friends with the first George Bush when he was director of the CIA. So he's really mad, and he's in jail, and he's got like a 5-year sentence. So he calls up one of his friends at the FBI. And they had been struggling with a counterfeiting ring in the Middle East where they were counterfeiting $100 bills all over the Middle East, and they were using them to buy weapons. U.S. $100 bills. So Sarkis says to the guy, the FBI, disagreeing with somebody, those are things that are not going to get a case overturned, but we still file them off of it. Which reminds me, I just have to tell the story. It's in the book, but I'll tell it anyway, of a famous jury deliberations in L.A. where there was a juror who was acting a little strange during the trial, and they almost kicked her off during the trial, but for some reason she was kept on. She goes back in the jury room and she won't deliberate. And so they say, well, what do you want? She says, well, as a matter of fact, I brought a movie. And the movie was The Last Emperor. I don't remember if some of you may have seen that. It's been a while back. It was voted Best Picture. Nice movie. 3.5 hours long, however. She was not going to deliberate until they watched that movie. No one could figure out why exactly she wanted to see it or what relevance it had to the case, but a number of the jurors basically said, all right, we'll sit and watch the movie. Eventually a couple of jurors sort of said, hold it here. Let's talk to the judge about this. They sent out a note to the judge, told him what was going on, and she did get kicked off the jury. But I always thought that was just the most fascinating. Jurors are the things that go on there, I think, we're better off not knowing. I always love, going and talking to jurors, and I've won a case, and I'm excited, and I'm high, and it's just like this is great. And you go out, and you're thinking, okay, what was it that won the case? Was it that brilliant closing argument I did? And they look at you and go, no, I don't really remember anything about that. Well, was it that cross-examination where I tore the guy apart? No, I thought he was a pretty good witness. There's nothing that bursts your bubble quicker than talking to a juror. So.
Okay, one last question.
Somebody else. That doesn't get more exculpatory. So it's very frustrating, and what really is frustrating and why I'm so glad you asked the question is, in the U.S., there is almost no penalty for a prosecutor violating Brady rules. It is just essentially no harm, no foul, and there is harm. And what we have run into, and I talk about this in the book quite a bit, that states don't even, for example, they don't even discipline them. State bars don't even discipline. And there have been numerous instances where judges have found prosecutorial misconduct because of failure to do it. And so they get reported to the state bar, and the state bar just ignores it. There was a study done that showed, I want to say, over the course of, it was 3 or 4 years, I can't remember, something like 700 cases of prosecutorial misconduct had been found by judges over the state of California. Less than 2% were actually disciplined. So there's no repercussions. There's no reason why, if they don't turn it over, and great for them, they've got a better chance of winning. If they get caught, so what? Nothing's going to happen to them. I actually had a case in Philadelphia, in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia, where after the trial, we had a hearing on prosecutorial misconduct, and the U.S. Attorney, he was an assistant U.S. Attorney, was found to have committed prosecutorial misconduct by essentially he had dissuaded a witness from coming. That's a crime, okay? And they prosecute it frequently if it happens the defendant does it. He was found by the judge to have done that. What was his punishment? He got promoted to head U.S. Attorney. Yeah, within like 3 months of that, after having been found by a judge to have committed prosecutorial misconduct like that. It's an amazing thing. There is no punishment.